Hello, hello, hello. DeKalb County School District stakeholders, parents, families, community members, staff members, all of you, all of those able to join us today. My name is Norman Sauce, very proudly serving DeKalb County School District as interim superintendent. And let me first by thanking each and every one of you sincerely, not only for being here with us this afternoon on this virtual discussion, but also for your engagement and participation in this very important student assignment project process. Thank you for being here. Thank you for lending your perspectives, your experiences, and your viewpoints on the important matters that we'll be discussing beginning today, and we'll continue this discussion for the next several months. Today, we'll be sharing round one scenarios and addressing questions that you present. As enrollment declines and resources stretch in our school district, we have a responsibility to look ahead and plan in ways that support long-term sustainability and strong opportunities for every student. And this student assignment project, with your feedback, is designed to ensure that our schools are aligned with enrollment trends and the evolving needs of our community. Please note, and I cannot stress this enough, please note that no final decisions have been made of any kind. What you've seen already publicly and what we'll be further discussing today are nothing more than round one scenario conversation starters. These scenarios that you're about to see are starting points for our conversations. Your input matters greatly. And that's exactly why we're hosting these sessions, not only this week, but additional one plans into March and even after that throughout this spring. Your feedback on our feedback survey will help shape the next round of scenarios that we'll share later in March and even more beyond that. We've partnered with a group of experts called HPM Group for this student assignment plan project process to guide our decision making, our research, our data analysis, and our scenarios development. They've also helped school districts around the country conduct the same work, including very recently here in Metro Atlanta. So now, without further ado, I do want to turn it over to HPM and to their vice president, Mr. Tracy Richter. He and his team are going to take us through the next phases of this discussion this afternoon. So again, thank you all for being here. And Mr. Richter, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sauce. And once again, we'd like to thank you for participating today and as you continue to participate through this process. First, we want to tell you that we will be, as we go through the process today, you are going to see a recorded video that takes just a little over 20 minutes. And the reason we've decided to do this is that we want to make sure that everybody is hearing the consistent message as we move forward. I think as we go into this process, we can't iterate enough. And I know Dr. Sauce said this several times and we'll continue to say it. This is a beginning point of conversation. And the conversation needs to, at first, as we entered a data-driven process, have the community now, participate in this process to help us shape this data to make sure that we're ensuring the future facilities for your students and for the success of all students in the district. We acknowledge that this is a complicated process. We understand it's an emotional process. We don't come at this lightly, and we don't come at this with any joy to have this conversation, certainly. We know this is a national epidemic right now in public schools that we are facing in declining enrollment and stressed facilities and low budgets. And so we want to make sure that we're doing this the right way. And so over the next several months, there's going to be several opportunities to continue to participate in this process. But we have to have a starting point. And today is our starting point with the community as we talk to you over the next several months. So with that, we're going to start a video, and then we're going to go through a very quick frequently asked questions, and then we're going to acknowledge questions for the rest of the meeting. So once again, thank you for participating. I might want to say one more thing. Understand that this process will take approximately 5 to 8 years to complete as we walk through a process like this. This is a slow process to go through this much change in a district, and we want to acknowledge that a process like this will take time to get through. No actions will be taken next year as the process will run into the fall. And so we want to acknowledge that. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over and start the video.
Hello, I am Scott Leopold, Director of Planning Services with HPM. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this online presentation. This resource is designed to clearly explain the initial facility scenarios for the DeKalb County School District and to support ongoing discussion across our community. Nothing you see here is final. These scenarios are starting points, intentionally drafted at a high level so that we can gather meaningful feedback from families, staff, and community members. The goal is simple: to create a stronger, more equitable, and more efficient school district where every student, regardless of where they live, has access to well-resourced learning environments. This presentation provides an overview of the initial facility scenarios, the first round of ideas meant to spark conversation. These scenarios serve as a framework to gather your thoughts, questions, and suggestions. Before we discuss buildings or grade configurations, it's important to center the work on why we are doing this. The district was built to serve 110,000 students, but now serves around 92,000. The enrollment is projected to decline further. The Student Assignment Project, or SAP, ensures that the resources follow the students, not the empty seats. This chart tracks historical enrollment against capacity over time. Over the past decade, enrollment has declined while the facility capacity remains high, leaving more than 20,000 empty seats. There are 5 core reasons driving this work: declining enrollment, buildings needing repair, capacity imbalance, transportation inefficiencies, and the need to consolidate resources. To better understand the 5 reasons why, consider that if we better manage the declining student enrollment and have fewer underutilized schools, then we can improve support for the diverse learner needs through more intentional differentiation and targeted interventions. If we have less school buildings that need significant repair and improvement, then we can actualize cost avoidance to reinvest in fewer buildings with greater impact. If we balance the capacity at our schools, then we can enhance access to instructional and student support resources, as balanced capacity allows schools to more effectively utilize spaces, staff, and materials. If we have more efficient transportation routes, then we can reduce student commute times with schools located closer to home, leading to less time on buses and more time for learning, rest, and family engagement. If we have fewer buildings to operate overall, then we can consolidate resources, invest in educators and specialized staff, expand academic, social, emotional, and behavioral supports for students. Many may wonder why we are focusing specifically on buildings right now and not considering boundaries of programs. At this point in the plan, facilities serve as the non-negotiable. We need to determine which facilities align best with our demographics, and in the fall of 2026, once the building portfolio is determined, we will overlay boundaries and programs. It is critical to separate buildings from the programs because we do not want programs or boundaries to dictate which buildings are most strategic to the district. This is an illustration of building efficiency. When an elementary school is enrolled below 450 students, the dollars from the state fund for a principal and a half nurse, and any other positions beyond teachers will need to be funded with local dollars. This leads to resources being spread thin when there are many low-enrolled campuses. As you can see, as the enrollment starts to increase over 450, you start to get a higher share of state funding. The big takeaway from this concept is that services at smaller schools are subsidized by larger schools. This local funding is to keep the same level of service at schools with low enrollment is not sustainable. Another way to illustrate the challenges that we are having is this decision triangle. If a district wants low operating costs with robust program offerings, it is difficult to have small school sizes. If a district wants small school sizes and low operating costs, it is difficult to offer robust programming. If a district wants robust program offerings with small schools, it is difficult to have low operating costs. We are not asking you as a community to pick which are the most important, but we want you to understand the trade-offs. Every district's triangle is unique and based on their community. Now, to tie all of this together, without action, declining enrollment will stretch resources too thin across too many facilities. Now we will discuss the process that was followed to get where we are and how different stakeholder groups have and will engage. The SAP committee is composed of 150 members that have advised this effort throughout the process. They are charged with advising on reimagining DCSD's buildings, boundaries, and programs. The SAP committee is not the final decision maker. This group helped to establish guiding principles that serve as a benchmark throughout the process. Beginning in the fall of 2025, the committee transitioned to providing guidance to the district operations team and the HPM consulting team in order to develop and refine scenarios. The scenarios that you will see in this presentation were developed by district staff and consultants, influenced by the guiding principles and other feedback from the SAP committee. The Board of Education is responsible for final decisions, not the SAP committee. Now for a little more information on operations and HPM. Again, all the input from the SAP committee was shared with operations and the HPM consulting group to develop scenarios. HPM will lead the scenario and community engagement phase between January and May of this year. HPM will ensure that feedback from all stakeholders is incorporated into future iterations of scenarios. The graphic details the flow of community feedback and how it is incorporated into the process. This is planning in public. It may look like this is an incomplete scenario, and that is intentional. We want to collect feedback along the way to ensure that this plan incorporates community feedback. We have shared the initial scenario publicly and are in the process of collecting feedback that will inform the next iteration of the scenarios. As we move forward in this process, the scenarios will become more detailed and refined. To collect feedback, there is an online survey available in 13 languages. HL Strategy, an independent third party, will compile the feedback from the survey and provide reports to DCSD, HPM, and that feedback will then be shared with stakeholders. We will also use the survey to identify any groups that have not engaged in the process so that we can perform some additional targeted outreach in the form of focus groups. The board receives updates monthly. Final recommendations, including boundaries and programs, are expected in the late fall of 2026. This section explains how these initial scenarios were designed. Again, this is what planning in public looks like. This is the first round of scenarios intended to start conversations and gather feedback. Nothing has been decided, and these are not final plans. We need your feedback to better refine what comes next. The community voice is just as important as the data. In order to develop scenarios, we considered factors like the proximity of facility locations to student centers, the proximity of facilities to other facilities, building adequacy, which includes capacity. For example, there are 24 elementary schools that are below 600 student capacity. We also considered cascading use to use our best buildings with the most capacity, and also recent investment in facilities. Another important consideration is that this is a highly interconnected plan. Making changes to one facility may impact several others and cause us to reevaluate the entire scenario. Another major factor in this scenario is the concept of cascading use. What this means is that we want to preserve our middle and high school facilities as strategic assets. This is because they are our largest and most efficient facilities from an operations standpoint, but they are also more expensive than elementaries and take much longer to construct. So by converting high schools down to middle schools and middle schools down to elementary schools, we keep those larger and more efficient buildings in their portfolio. But this does shift the impact of consolidation down to the elementary level. Another benefit to this concept is that if demographics do shift in the future, and there are needs for additional high schools in some areas of the district, we will have the facilities that can be converted back. As we get into the initial scenario, remember that this is the initial scenario and that your feedback will inform and refine future iterations. One last thing before we get into the scenario slides is I want to provide some details on possible facility reuse plans. The last thing anybody wants is abandoned buildings. For facilities that are ultimately recommended to close, after all iterations and feedback, there will be a dedicated process to determine what happens to them. Possible actions may include, but are not limited to, repurpose for non-instructional use, like office space, use for expanded early childhood programs, work with other public entities for alternative use, or land bank for future uses of the site, demolishing the building and planting grass. This map shows the facility actions for this scenario. Please feel free to pause this video or look at the slides on the resources page to get a better look. Shown in green are 3 high schools proposed to convert to middle schools: Cedar Grove, Lithonia, and Towers. Shown in orange are 5 middle schools proposed to convert to elementary schools: Bethune, Champion Theme, Lithonia, McNair, and Miller Grove. Shown as red X's are the potential closures or repurposed buildings. Shown as blue circles are potential capacity expansion projects. Buildings in gray have no changes in school use. It should be noted that closures or repurposes in areas near potential capacity projects are dependent on those expansion projects. These facilities are well utilized, but they are just too small. The capacity expansion projects get the average size of facilities in these areas from under 500 to over 750. It should be noted that in future iterations, there will be a capital improvement plan overlaid on the entire portfolio. This will include renovation, modernizations, and other facility improvements in all parts of the district. Lastly, this is a long-term plan that would take at least 6 to 8 years to fully implement, and there are no changes for the 26-27 school year. This slide details each facility along with the capacity and utilization metrics. Schools highlighted in yellow are cascading use and changing grade configuration. Schools in blue require capacity expansions. The big takeaway is that this plan reduces nearly 15,000 of the over 20,000 empty seats. And the projected utilization in the year 2030 goes up to 88% from 76%. This allows for more resources to be redirected into the classrooms. The next few slides show how we came to this initial scenario. Because high schools are our largest and most efficient facilities, we started there. Forecasted enrollment shows that in the year 2030, we will have 4 high schools worth of excess seats, so we started with a scenario that reduces 3. Towers High School has the lowest building adequacy and is in close proximity to the larger and more adequate Columbia High School. Cedar Grove High School has low building adequacy and is in close proximity to the larger and more adequate McNair High School. Lithonia High School is smaller and in very close proximity to the larger and newer Miller Grove High School. Moving on to middle schools. In 2030, we are forecasted to have 5 middle schools worth of excess seats. Then we also have the 3 high schools we have cascaded down. That brings our total to 8. This scenario converts 5 middle schools to elementary schools and closes 1. Because of cascading use, McNair Middle School, Bethune Middle School, Miller Grove Middle School, and Lithonia Middle School all convert to elementaries. Champion Theme Middle School converts to an elementary because it has the lowest building adequacy of all middle schools. The program will move to a new location. Cedar Grove Middle School closes due to cascading use and excess elementary capacity in the area. Moving on to elementaries, which is where the vast majority of the closures or reuses occur. By the year 2030, we are forecasted to have 20 elementary schools worth of excess seats, and converting 5 middle schools gives us an additional 10 elementary schools of excess seats. This scenario closes or repurposes 26 elementary schools. Elementaries in areas of underutilization close due to capacity in the area along with cascading use. Elementaries that are appropriately placed and well utilized have proposed facility additions. Elementaries that have low building adequacy and are in close proximity to schools with excess capacity or planned additions are proposed to close. This diagram shows the cascading use in a visual way. Please feel free to pause to get a better look. This identifies high schools converted to middle schools, and then middle schools converted to elementary schools. That you may not see your facility listed on any of the maps or slides in this initial scenario. Please know that they're being addressed through separate actions based on building and programmatic needs. Adequate placement for all students and programs will be incorporated into future iterations. The following slides explore some different grade configurations that may be incorporated into future iterations. These different configurations can be adapted with the same 27 closures. They may provide benefits to different parts of the district, but they do come with trade-offs. This is the traditional pre-K through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12 configuration. This is what the district currently runs in most of its facilities. Benefits include access to robust programming when well enrolled, allows for 3 tiers of transportation with a reduced need for buses and drivers, environments that are aligned with students' developmental needs, and it is familiar. Challenges are that when enrollment is low, resources can be spread thin, multiple transitions for students, and less grades per building means that parents can have more pickups and drop-offs with multiple children. The middle school and high school concept will also work with the PK3, 4, 5, which we'll talk about on a future slide. PK through 8 model. It should be noted that we need to have a total of enrollment of around 900 students in order for this model to be operationally efficient. Benefits include more access to advanced curriculum. Having more students in larger building is more efficient. There's only one transition, K through 12. More grades in the building means less pickups and drop-offs for families with multiple children. Having students in the same building for 9 years can build lasting relationships. Challenges include limited programming at middle grades due to smaller cohorts. Extracurriculars may also look different. There may be additional staffing certification needs. Facility modifications may be needed, and moving to a 2-tier transportation system may require more buses and drivers. Some students may struggle with the 8th to 9th grade transition, and challenges around having a wide range of developmental stages of students. Here is the 6 through 12 model. Benefits include middle school students can have more access to advanced coursework. More students in a larger building is more efficient. There's only one transition, K through 12. More grades in the building means less pickups and drop-offs for families with multiple children. It allows for the preservation of all high school communities. It also allows students to build lasting relationships. Challenges include smaller cohorts, resulting in lower numbers for enhanced programming. Due to the small cohorts, extracurriculars will look different. There may also be additional staffing considerations. Moving to a 2-tier transportation system may require more buses and drivers. And there's challenges around a wide range of developmental stages of the students. I think that the big takeaway with this one is it allows all the high schools to stay high schools. But if programming is a struggle due to low enrollment now, it still would be under this model. This last model is the PK3, 4, 5. This allows for a focus on early literacy. Other benefits include allowing buildings with lower enrollment to operate more efficiently. It also works well where buildings are in close proximity so that students can be on the same bus route. And having larger cohorts has more opportunity to address differentiated learning needs. Challenges include adding a transition, and that can be additionally disruptive. Existing facilities may need some modifications, and there is also a higher likelihood that siblings would be in multiple buildings. There is also shorter time for staff to form relationships with families and students. To close out the grade band discussion, here are some examples of how they could work specifically for DCSD. For Cross Keys, once Sequoia opens, Cross Keys High School will not have a natural middle school. If that whole cluster transitions to PK through 8, there would be no need for a middle school. Alternative to converting high schools to middle schools. Converting a high school with excess capacity to a 6 through 12 campus can better use those buildings and keep more high school clusters. As an example, instead of Cedar Grove High School converting to a middle school that feeds into McNair, both Cedar Grove and McNair High Schools could convert to 612 campuses. The middle schools in these areas would then still cascade into elementary schools as proposed. The PK3-4-5, again also called the primary and intermediate elementary schools. In the Dunwoody cluster, this used to occur. Also, currently, the city schools of Decatur run a similar configuration, PK-2 and 3-5. Feedback is what this process is all about. We need your feedback to make things better and more tailored to the community needs. Think district-wide and long-term. This plan considers all DCSD students and will shape the district for decades. Please be specific about the schools, areas, and concerns you're addressing. Provide respectful and actionable feedback. Personal attacks or threats will not be tolerated and will be removed. Feedback should be given through the online survey so that it can directly inform the next phase. Multiple ways to engage. The survey will be checked in real time. Common themes will be used to develop an FAQ, and additional feedback options will be offered to ensure broad access and participation. I will talk a little bit about the timeline. Again, this process kicked off in the fall with the SAP committee, and we are in the scenario development and feedback phase now. We will have additional scenarios informed by your feedback in the early spring. We will continue to refine over the summer with consideration and board action in the fall. Here is the overall schedule for the feedback sessions, both in person and virtual. The February meetings are for this initial scenario, and the March sessions will be for the next iteration based on your feedback. All feedback will be considered regardless of volume or frequency, and it should be directed towards the survey. We will be providing an FAQ before the feedback sessions, and it will be added to throughout the process. Thank you for taking the time to view this presentation.
So we appreciate the patience you've had to sit through this, and we wanted to make sure that you had all the information that we have to date. A couple of things that we want to acknowledge here is that we understand that, first of all, this is very impactful to communities, and we understand that it is an emotional and can be very emotionally charged process. And so we do acknowledge that, and we acknowledge that this love and legacy of schools does matter, and the schools and communities do matter. I think this realignment, again, is a difficult thing that we got to do. I think some of the things that we want to address very quickly are why, and some of those frequently asked questions. And we want to make sure that, and this is posted on the website, that you can see these frequently asked questions, and we'll be continuing to go through these. But we want to make sure that that declining enrollment affects schools in a lot of different ways. Fewer course offerings, fewer teachers per grade level, the ability to offer all the extracurricular and clubs that we want to offer by school, and making sure that our dollars are spent right. Scott covered a lot, but what's involved in guiding this work is that the SAP process has been going on for well over a year, and helped by developing some guiding principles to overlay a first round of scenarios out there. And remember, the SAP committee is an advisory only. They had no decision-making power in this, and they added a lot of value to giving feedback on things like enrollment and operational financial data and program data out there. And again, how do decisions get made? Again, no decisions have been made. We're going to use these metrics, test the ideas, gather feedback, refine scenarios, and then repeat this process until we have clear and informed recommendations as we go through. Everything will be listened to, and you can assure that as we go through this process, that we will listen to those. The most vital way we can get that is through the recorded message. So, surveying and attending, when you attend community meetings, if you're able to attend in person, comment cards are very important, so we can record the data and we can see it all on paper. And so we want to be sure that you know the metrics being used. We did consider distance from schools for students. We looked at capacity and the ability to accommodate flexible capacity in the future. Age and condition and investment into facilities is an important thing here. But we need to make sure as we're going through this that we didn't miss anything, and that as we go through this exercise, one of the important pieces of the community input piece for us is to see those things that, from your perspective as community members, that we may not be able to see. And I think that's really, really important. And so, as we go through this, I just want to make sure that you know that if a building does close, that there will be an intentional repurpose of the buildings, and we have to identify those before we leave. And I think at the end of this, why we believe this is such an important phase to the process that we go through is that we need to continue to test the assumptions that we have out there. We need to identify those unintended consequences that may be out there. We're going to improve and refine these scenarios as we go along. Please understand that we do pay attention to those programs that are in buildings. Things like, I know people might be concerned about, I have an exceptional student education. I have a student that is in a program that is necessary for their individual instruction plan. We do look at that. We want to make sure that the facilities that we are looking to cascade into have the ability to handle those programs and be able to be well staffed and resourced. And so eventually to get to recommendations that reflect the district-wide priorities. And I think that's the last thing I want to say this on the facts is that as we go into the recommendations, there is a balance between those individual needs of communities and schools with a district-wide vision. And so the first scenario at this applied a district-wide scenario. And so as we go further into discussions and we have several different community meetings out there and we get more specific to your neighborhoods and your communities, we will get to a lot of those. And so, eventually what we want to do at the end of this is we want to allow capacity and enrollment to strengthen academic programs out there. We want to better support the educators out there. We want to invest directly into student learning, not empty seats. And we do want to plan responsibly for the future. And part of that responsibility is to make sure that we're academically and operationally in line to where we get to. And remember that feedback is going to be continuous over the next several months. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Campbell for the instructions on how to participate in the Q&A.
Thank you, Tracy, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharice Campbell, and I am the Chief of Community Engagement and Innovative Partnerships here in DeKalb County Schools. And first, I just want to let you know that we are committed to hearing from you. So as we go through our questions today, your question may not be answered within the time that we're together, but trust that it will be captured and answered within our FAQ document that is on our SAP website. The way you will post your questions today is in the Q&A box. So if you see the Q&A box is at the bottom of your window, I see that some of you have already found that box, but that's the way you're going to post your questions. And then Miss Sarita Smith will be our facilitator. She'll capture those questions and toss it to one of our team members to be able to answer it. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarita.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. My name is Sarita Smith, Executive Director of Student Assignments. I have had the pleasure of working with the SAP committee over the last 22 months. Happy to be at a point where we can get larger and greater community feedback. And I am going to start with some questions. So as you guys are putting them in the chat, I have some colleagues and coworkers online that are going to be answering some and some that I think we need to answer live for the greater good of the group. So I'm going to kick it off with a few that I've seen that we kind of put in some general buckets, and then I'll have my friends at HPM help us answer some of these. So the first one is around just why specific schools were being proposed to close. So I'll have my friend Scott help us with that one.
Great. Thank you, Sarita. Again, Scott Leopold with HPM. My voice should sound familiar because we've been listening to it for the last several minutes. Sorry. The answer to this one is it's not a simple question. There's a lot of different factors that go into making these decisions. We looked at enrollment. We looked at the educational adequacy of the building kind of as those primary drivers. We also looked at the positions of the buildings. And so Are they close to other buildings that can serve the same purpose? Do we have cascading use in play? Do we have a middle school shifting down to be an elementary that provides excess capacity? And we also look at the suitability of each site. Can the site be expanded to be large enough to hold enough students to be efficient? That's another major factor that we look at across all schools. And so again, I don't want to talk like there's a magic formula. There's a lot of different data points that go into this, and the feedback is one data point. And so we really want to get your feedback in a positive way. So, what we don't want to hear is, well, don't close our school, close their school instead. We want to hear, what can constructively happen to move forward. We want you to understand what the issue is and how your students can benefit from being in a better resourced facility.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Another question is just, I think we alluded to in the video that this isn't a fully fleshed out plan. This is kind of the starting point. So there's a lot of questions about if one school closes, where will those students go? Yeah.
Do you want me to pick this one up?
Sure.
Okay, so I do think that ultimately boundaries will help decide this, but the bigger goal is, and one of the reasons that we have implemented this cascading approach is that the ultimate goal would be, how do we keep entire enrollments together? By having those larger capacity buildings, we have more ability to do that. And so even though we may close a building, the school community could stay together. And so I think that's one thing. But I think you have to determine, and I think this is what is complicated about planning, is that, what do you do first, boundaries or buildings or programs? Well, I think there is an idea where you have to understand your portfolio of buildings and the capacity that you have out there before you can start to make some decisions on boundaries and how to make sure we appropriately place all the programs that we want to put in there. And so admittedly, it's not fully fleshed out. And I think that part of this is understanding where we're going to have capacity, where we need capacity, where we keep capacity to have flexibility for the future. And I think this is a really important piece, is that if we build that capacity so we have flexibility for the future, we understand that all parts of this district will eventually come back around in enrollment, maybe population, housing, those kind of things. Cities tend to do that. And so we want to make sure that we are there. But we do acknowledge it doesn't feel like it's fully fleshed out yet. But we get to those facilities based on those parameters that, first of all, SAP set up and that Scott talked about in the video.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. So this is I think a little an allusion to kind of this cascading effect and maybe even that chart where we talked about the 450 plus or minus students. The question is, people understand that undercrowded facilities make sense to consolidate, but why are there schools that are overcrowded on the closure list? You want to take that one, Scott?
Sure. That's a great question. Why are facilities that are well enrolled on this closure list? What we're really looking at here is, again, that efficiency piece. I think a great example is the Lakeside cluster. There's like 6 or 7 elementary schools in the Lakeside cluster, and they're all well utilized, but they're all between 450 and 550 students, which is just a little bit too small. And so in this scenario, what we're doing is we're consolidating those schools down to 3 that are added on to. And so we looked at all of the facilities in the Lakeside cluster, for example, and we found the 3 that are, kind of spaced strategically throughout that cluster and also have appropriate sites to be able to be added on to. And so we want to get to a point where, if we look at each cluster individually, we want to have a high school that's about 1,600 students, a middle school that's about 1,200 students, and then that would necessitate about 2,400 elementary students. And we don't want to get into a situation where we have 6 elementary schools of 400. Let's get 3 of 800. And so we want to get to that larger elementary capacity, and we're able to do that in many areas by combining onto larger sites so that we can get those larger enrollment numbers, more resources into the classroom. That's really the theme of what we're trying to do.
So along with that, Scott, there's a question just about primary enrollment factors, like why the small schools. Can we speak a little bit to that? Because there are some questions about some of our schools on the north end, obviously on the consideration list, knowing that they are functioning well, that there's high academic proficiency there. So why those kind of schools are being considered kind of goes along with your small school
And
question.
so, again, I'll kind of reiterate what we said a little bit in the presentation is that, people like to have those small school communities. And in many cases, those communities are being resourced supplementally by the district. And so, dollars from the state may fund things like a principal and a half nurse. But if they want to get a lot of those extra positions, interventionists and those types of things, they might need to be supplemented by local dollars. And so by getting into those larger enrollment numbers, whether it's in the north or the south of the district, that gets us kind of that critical mass to get more dollars into the classroom. I do want to kind of differentiate because we do have, some dissimilar situations in the north and the south. In the south area, we have underutilization and we have larger facilities. And so in a lot of cases, we don't need to add on because we have adequate capacity there from both buildings that have been replaced recently and also cascading middle schools and high schools down to lower grades.
Okay, thank you.
So Rita, can I add just one more thing to
Yeah,
that? Because I think it's important. One of the first things that we had to do was we had to apply a district-wide application of the data across. And so, things like cascading into buildings that you may not understand why one area has cascading and another area does when you see those enrollment numbers, utilization numbers. But one thing we want to do is we wanted to apply an equal application of that. The other thing is adding an equal application of what Scott referred to as, the educational suitability of a site or educational suitability of a building. That doesn't reflect on the programs in there, but it reflects the facility and how it can handle future enrollment and program offerings that DeKalb County wants to offer. And so our first goal was to make sure that we had an equitable kind of overlay of the criteria. And so you do see that in some of those schools in the north. And again, admittedly, we want to acknowledge that they are, and across the district, you've got schools that are performing, you've got schools that are utilized in the right way. But when you start to apply things like we want to get our buildings to a capacity that's going to be equitable across the district, then we need to start applying those. Now, as we go through the process, we make adaptations and adjustments to that. And so things like capacity additions could mean that in future SPLOS programs, we would replace a building at a bigger capacity in order to get that capacity expansion. It just doesn't mean classroom expansions or things like that. So I think that's a big part of this too. And so I think the first thing that we have to do in a district-wide view of this is apply data and our criteria equally across. And then as you start to get into those more minutia of community need and community reflection of this is where we start to make some of those adaptations.
Thank you, Tracy. Just kind of rolling on with the data piece, there's a question about the data that was used to develop the scenarios and if that data is public. You guys want to speak to the dashboard and where families can find that? I will make sure we drop that in the chat.
Yeah, we'll drop that in the chat, but all of the information that we use to develop these scenarios is on the either the survey landing page or it's on that SAP website. The state of the schools report, the dashboard, all those things are available that you can kind of drill down into to kind of see the journey that we've been on for the past several months.
Thank you. And to echo that, there is on the survey landing page, we broke down kind of the same presentation into the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Under the how scenarios were developed, we did link a few related data resources, and that dashboard is a large resource, so make sure you guys check that out. All right, Tracy, there's a question about the timeline. Is 6 to 8 years really feasible? Is that too long, too short? There's some varying opinions on it being too long, some saying it's way too fast. Can you speak to that and just your experience in that in general?
Again, these are just excellent questions because they help clarity. I think, a 6 to 8 year process includes the idea that in some of these things, what we have to do is we have to invest in the facilities. And so either, just a minute ago when I talked about capacity expansion, we may have to replace a building to get it a larger capacity, okay, at some point. Those map dots in blue, for instance, in those cases where it might take a little longer in the eSPLOS program to get to that building, building, or to make improvements onto facilities as students start to walk into those facilities. What we don't want to happen is we don't want in this process for students to walk into another facility that has less opportunity and less resource and spaces than the building that they would have to leave. And so part of the investment strategy is that you want to make sure you invest in the facilities that students are walking into. In some cases, that won't be necessary. And so those schools end up falling closer in the timeline. Is 6 to 8 years reasonable? I think that as we look at the amount of funding you're going to have for reinvestment into your facilities, I think it's a reasonable timeline. But what I also think, and I think this is really, really important, is that this will be a guideline as we move forward in the next several years. And we know that districts change in time. And so what we want to be sure of is that we're providing some flexibility of review as we go through this process. And it doesn't take long ago to remember that the world turned upside down, and the way we delivered schools and how we looked at schools is a lot different than it was just 6 years ago. And so we want to make sure we have that flexibility out there. So is it too fast? Is it too slow? I think as we go and we refine this more, we're going to have a more defined plan about how long it really will take to get this in. But all those things got to be considered, how we can do boundaries in the right process timeline, how we can assign those programs, but get them into the right invested buildings. And that's going to take a little time as we invest in those buildings before students move into them.
Thank you. There was a question about how the SAP committee was established and developed. So in spring of 2024, we issued a kind of open call to community members and partners. It was called a call to action. And so anyone could apply. And then there was a group of diverse staff who had a metrics that they then reviewed applications through that were non-identifiable. And from that process came the 150 seats that we offered. And those were to people across the district. So we tried to get obviously some equal representation across board districts so we could have as many diverse voices as possible. As some people rolled off over that first year, we did replenish that based on, again, areas that just weren't as widely represented as others. And we are still pretty strong at about 150 people today. So this, I'm going to ask somebody from either our CNI or schools team to jump in on this question. And this is about if we do consolidate two different schools and one of them is on a school improvement plan or on a maybe a government list, and we combine those schools academically, do we have supports or services on how we would consolidate those two different school environments? And I see a few of our CNI folks and schools people on here. Possibly could take a stab at answering that.
Miss
Dr.
Smith, ask
Tart?
that again. Yeah, ask
Yes.
that again, and then I'll Dr. Tart, if you don't mind, I'll let you chime in.
Yeah, sure. So if there is a proposed consolidation and one school CSIP plan is, it has some challenging barriers to overcome, and one is not, and we decide that those are two buildings that will combine. Is there some academic and school-based supports for those two communities combining? And I see you too, Dr. Alexander.
Yes,
Does that make sense, Dr. Yeah. Go ahead.
End of the response to the question around the CSIPs, those schools and our Georgia Department of Education, we will evaluate all of the data and ensure that once the data is received and we're reviewing the data from our state, if a school should be impacted in any way, that will be on a case-by-case basis, and we'll be reviewing the data as it relates to any school placements. So I think you answered that question, Sarita. Thank you, though.
Okay. There's a pre-K question. This one's a pretty good one. So given that some of our the possibilities of reusing some buildings may be for additional early learning centers, the question is, are the pre-K programs funded by, who are they funded by, and how will we maybe do that? Is there a similar funding source like local property tax that they're paid for? So how will we fund that if we choose to use a building for pre-K in the future? Dr. Sauce, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. So we're very, very proud of the DeKalb County School District is the largest provider of pre-K in the state of Georgia. There's not another school district or another private organization that provides more pre-K seats than we do in the entire state, and we're extremely proud of that. And to speak to that question and to unpack it a little bit, starting with pre-K 4, so 4-year-olds who are served in pre-K. So the state of Georgia, the Department of, the state budget provides for most of the monies for the pre-K 4 seats that a school district provides through lottery funds. So you see it advertised and promoted a good bit about one of the benefits of the state lottery is that it goes towards pre-K funding, and that's true. The vast majority of the expenses related to pre-K 4 for our district and others who offer pre-K 4 are provided for by the state. Now there's a few variations here and there, but more than 80% of pre-K 4 monies expenses are covered by the state. Pre-K 3, which we also offer in DeKalb County School District, is not funded by the state. Pre-K 3 is funded locally. It's something that our school district 8 or 9 years ago made the commitment to provide for, and it comes from our local budget. It's not something that's provided for or supplemented by the state. Most public school districts in Georgia do not offer pre-K 3. There are some that do. We do, of course, and there are some that offer it for tuition. We don't charge tuition. So to answer the question directly, pre-K 4 is mostly funded by state lottery funds. Pre-K 3 is funded locally.
Thank you, Dr. Sauce. Oh, I thought I heard someone else trying to jump in. Okay, so moving on to some of our evaluation metrics. We have a community member that said they find it pretty interesting that we have not used academic performance or achievement as a part of the metrics in this process. So Tracy, you want to take a stab at answering that one on why academic performance isn't one of the measures criteria we used?
Yeah, I do. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that we do understand that there could be concern if schools that might be consolidated would be consolidated into schools that might be less performing on paper as we see that. So we understand that. But we also understand the dynamic of school evaluation for performance, and that oftentimes when schools are faced with different circumstances. So for instance, if they're stretched their resources and don't have the resources in the building, does it really reflect how they can perform in a building? We also want to acknowledge that we know that schools make gains, and that might not be reflected in what they might classify as the score, but they do make gains also. And so I think in the background information, we see school performance in there. But I think when in 25 years of doing this and walking through this conversation and more recently as we go, we want to be sure that as we look at some of the measures out there, that let's say that a school grade changes in time, does that mean all of a sudden, because the school performance changed, that we automatically can put it on another list, where the opportunity is to get all schools to be performing schools? And so, and I know that when we're trying to do this evaluation and trying to look at those schools that we're impacting, is that there are schools in there that are showing measures of success in there. And so again, the goal is, how do we get all schools to the performance level that they meet those performance level? Understanding there's, I don't know how many influences that impact school performance that sit outside even the school building. And so understand that we do acknowledge it and that we do see it. However, when you put it up on the metrics, is to say that if I were to put the schools, say for instance, on an A, B, C, D list, whatever, and a school this year is a B, but in 4 years, because of whatever measures happened to a building, whether the program got moved or change of administration or change in staffing or things like that, the school moved down to a C, let's say. Does that mean that I can change my kind of reflection of decision on that building? Well, no. I mean, I don't think that should be. I think that the goal is to get every school to the top performance levels. And so I think that as we walk through this process, I know that's one thing we're going to hear, and we're going to hear it several times. And I'm glad we're going to hear that, because I think as we make decisions on facilities, this may emerge as something that we consider more and more as we look into different parts of the different parts of the district and different needs in the district. So I hope that helps a little bit. I understand that everybody, there's the last thing is that when you see the list of criteria that go across, and whether you want to put school performance on there or if we put whatever it is on there, that different parts of the city require different criteria applications. And although the criteria is district wide, you can't prioritize sometimes the criteria out there, because one area might be driven by things like condition or adequacy. Another area might be driven by enrollment or the ability to have the capacity in a building. Another area might be driven by performance or program offerings. And so we need to make sure as we go through this process, even though the district-wide application of data is there, is that we start to have the communities help us to inform the data to then help us get closer to the criteria that affect each area of the city and the district, or the cities and the district.
Thank you, Tracy. Hofstetter, I'm going to chime you in for this one. A community member asked that we ultimately talk about, eventually there will be some closed facilities out of this process, and we showed a few possibilities. One did not include selling of property. Do you want to talk a little bit towards that and talk a little bit about kind of the process that's like beginning in the background around buildings that we may not use as specific school facilities after this is over?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. So yes, parallel to this process is what to use buildings that may become vacant. Now, throughout this process, many of our schools will not be closed. They'll be repurposed for other district needs. So they'll still be inhabited, mostly by children. If not, then for other purposes. If not, then we go and we work with the municipalities, counties, and other agencies, as Scott said earlier in the presentation. And we can look for other purposes and ways to still serve the community in a joint way. Now, should any facilities become purely vacant without any need for the school district, then we could look at certain processes for that. In addition to the existing schools that we're certainly talking about, the district also maintains a portfolio of vacant properties as it currently stands. So some of those potentially could become sales, but that would be over the disposal will of the board.
Thank you, Hofstetter. Okay, so I have a question. As Ms. Marcia, I believe, is on the call. There's a question, Ms. Cower, about how we are ensuring that underserved communities are being reached out beyond just translation services. Can you, I believe I saw her on the call. Yeah, there she is. Can you speak to just some of the efforts in your area, specifically all the amazing work you are doing with your team around us reaching as many diverse populations in this process as possible?
Okay, so we are planning to have smaller group meetings with some of our marginalized communities. We actually last week we sent out some information to all of our faith-based houses that we have on our list in terms of making sure that we're touching all bases. We're also going to tap into our groups of families that are challenged linguistically. One example of that is that we've already had a all Spanish SAP chat where the facilitators of that meeting spoke Spanish the whole way. So we'll do the same thing with our other communities. We're tapping into the meetings that are being held for our special ed communities or any of the other communities that we know that are considered marginalized.
Thank you, Ms. Cower. Tracy, there's another question around kind of the funding piece of this work. So if It was stated that larger schools ultimately subsidize smaller schools or smaller enrolled schools. The community members believes this is inaccurate, and schools do not subsidize other schools, but taxpayers fund and pay for schools. Can you speak to that as far as a county and not so much of a specific community effort?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, ultimately, yeah, you fund the schools as community members, there's no question. But when a school can't have a full-time music teacher, a full-time art teacher, a full-time, guidance counselor, a full-time whatever the staff member is, and has to share it with another building in order to make sure that every building has that service, then that means that it's being subsidized. Is that, we believe that when resources are in a building, they should be there the entire day. And throughout the district, we have resources throughout these programs that are behind a windshield part of the day to go to another school to serve those services. And so when we talk about subsidizing other schools, that's what it means, is that I believe that every student should have the full-time resources of the teacher or resource in the building at all times. And so when we have to share those services, that's what it means by subsidizing. And so what happens in school districts is that as the margins get wider across the board, and the district still intends to have an equitable as best they can program or resources in a building, and they have to share those resources, there's no way you can reach equity. And so and then when you start to push those resources where I think guidance is a good example that, at some schools where the guidance has, a caseload of, let's say 300, another one might have a caseload of 150 because of the amount of students in there. And that might be an extreme example. But what I'm saying is that when I have to start sharing my resources and I can't get resources in the building all the time, that means we're subsidizing those buildings. And so I completely agree that you are subsidizing. You are the taxpayer. You're the ones who fund this thing. And so again, one of the things that we look toward in this, and I think we get pushback on this, is that we have to look at kind of on the business side of this to say that, are we providing the maximum value for the taxpayer, the taxpayer dollar that's coming in? And when we have to do that and we don't get the equitable programs, I don't believe we are. And so I think one of the goals there is that we get the enrollment to the number that allows us that the more full-time resource in the buildings. That way we don't have to share the resources. We don't have to share a nurse. We don't have to share a media specialist. We don't have to share an art teacher. We don't have to share the music teacher. That we have the appropriate staff in the buildings because we have the right amount of buildings. The last thing I want to say to this is that a real example of this is that I was in a school district a year and a half ago that I walked into the first school board meeting that was in September, and I had the line of about 30 parents of special needs students that didn't have teachers in their buildings. And the district knew that the district response was that we have enough teachers, but we have too many buildings to make sure that we have enough special ed teachers in each of the buildings. And so that's when all of a sudden you start to see that you're having to subsidize those buildings by sharing those resources where the students don't have them all the time and they need them all the time. And so one of the goals here is just that. Get full-time resources in all buildings. Yeah. And when we can get to that measure by having the right amount of buildings, then we can stop some of that.
Appreciate that. All right, Scott, I have a question for you. There is a community member that says they understand why some of the closures and consolidations are focused in the South, but they hope to see in the next or future scenario that some of the investment is also in the South. How should we answer that question?
Great, thank you. Yes. Looking at the map, you see the blue dots kind of in that north area of the district. That is really because the consolidations, closures, repurposes that happen in the north part of the district are dependent on some of those capacity expansion projects. That's not needed in the South because there is underutilization and excess capacity. That all being said, in the next iteration, one of the things that you'll see is a capital improvement plan overlaid on top of everything. And so in addition to maybe some cascading, you'll also see recommendations for modernization, renovation, other building improvements overlaid on top of it. So it's not to say that the only investment is only going in those additions. There will be likely hundreds of millions of dollars planned on all facilities across the district to improve overall conditions and renovate. through innovations and modernizations.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure if we have someone from HR on the call. If not, I think we'll just take our best stab at this. But I think it's a good question for the masses, which says, how does projected staffing compare to enrollment? And is there a surplus that will require reallocation or a shortfall to adjust to the right amount? Dr. Sauce, I'm not sure if HR is on here. I think we have some general answers around this.
Say the question again for me, please, Ms. Smith.
Yeah, no worries. How do we, how does projected staffing compare to enrollment? And is there a surplus? If there is a surplus, how are we going to balance that? And I know we had some conversations initially with HR around just natural attrition over the last 5 years and how we would adjust, rolling this out incrementally.
Well, it's a fair question. At this juncture, obviously, we're discussing building utilization. We recognize that our enrollment has declined, and so we have to continue to look at how much staffing is needed to support the enrollment that we have. I will share, just focusing on central office for a moment, not necessarily tied to the SAP work, but it's related to this question, and it's a fair point. For those folks who watch our board meetings or stay in tune with the happenings and decisions that our board makes, just this past board meeting on February 9th, the board approved for us to work with an outside group to help us conduct a full assessment and analysis of our current central office posturing to ensure that we are postured in the way that we need to be to best serve and have maximum impact on our schools and on classrooms. Do we have too many of these positions, not enough of those positions? Are our personnel resources allocated properly compared to best practices and evidence-based practices for us to, again, have maximum impact on student achievement and student needs in the classroom? And so that's also part of my response to that question is, working with experts to guide our decision-making about how many positions we have, how they're situated, what divisions they reside in, so that we don't have too much, too little, redundancy, not enough, et cetera, for the positions that equate to maximum impact on student achievement. At a certain point, that also means, what about in the schoolhouse? But we are not talking in any way, shape, or form at this moment about reducing our force in the schoolhouse or having less teachers or less counselors. We're not having any conversations of those sorts. The only thing I'm referring to is this assessment of our central office posturing to make sure that we're not too redundant or too much or too little for maximum impact on student achievement. And it's an opportune time for us to do that because obviously we're having this student assignment project work underway, and it kind of coincides with this discussion about buildings. So that's the best I can offer now. But obviously, as we go forward in the coming years, if enrollment were to continue to decline, we have to look at the size of our workforce at a certain point. But that isn't today, aside from the central office assessment I just spoke of.
Thank you, Dr. Suss. Okay, so there's some questions. There's actually a few questions around distance of children from schools and how that affects transportation. I don't know if Hans or Yoke is also on the call, or maybe Hofstetter want to take this one, or Scott. How did we address that in the metrics? And I think there wasn't as much of an allusion to it in the video, but maybe we could talk about where that information is on the dashboard and how we integrated that into the process.
Yeah, I'll take that one.
Okay, thank you. And if I understood the question correctly, it was about transportation data?
Yeah, Scott's going to start it, and then if you want to.
Yeah, so with this question, we did look at kind of proximity of students to schools, and we also looked at proximity of schools to other schools. And so these are two metrics that we use in developing these options that can be found on the dashboard. If you look at the dashboard on the bottom right, there's a facility metrics exercise, which is very helpful. And it shows the average distance to, I think, the 3 closest neighboring schools as a metric on there for every school. And it also shows forecasted enrollment, and it's within 1 mile for elementary schools and 1.5 miles for middle school and high schools. And so those metrics are available and on the dashboard. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Eric.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, that's where we're at when it talks about building facilities. We're currently already going to all the schools as it is. Consolidating schools will put more students on the bus, getting better efficiency out of that, and not requiring as many routes. So in essence, yes, you'll be optimizing your routing program much better, much more efficiently, particularly with the amount of bus drivers we're able to employ every day and keep moving on with the busing program.
Thank you. Thank you. So there's a question about some of our one of our grade bands, and the community member has some concerns about, or like to better understand, I should say, kind of some safety and developmental measures if we do things like a 612. So that was a big conversation, I think, across the community, honestly. But the reality is Sequoia, Eric, right, is opening as a 612 soon. So in one way or fashion, we're going to have to figure this out by the time that Sequoia campus opens. So you want to talk just a little bit about Sequoia, and then if there's anyone from schools team that can talk just about like how the possibilities of separating grade bands and things of that nature within a building that may be fruitful as well.
Absolutely. And that's a great question because it is a very important question. So when we look at a facility from a facility point of view, we look how the facility is designed and where it lends for opportunities to somewhat keep children in different social development grade or age bands more separated. And we can do that by simply putting up walls, sealed doors, and uh, other facility modifications that would keep, maybe the 6/8s on one side and the 9/12s more to the other. Now, that being said, there may be some sharing of, some of the common spaces such as gyms, and that's where the principals usually get together and they work out a schedule for that, obviously with proper supervision. Those things can be worked out very much so. So again, with Sequoia being the example, Sequoia is one large continuous building with two wings separated by common areas such as cafeteria, dining rooms, as well as a couple of gyms. But it does have a wall with two separate entrances. So one side of the building will be more on the 6/8 focus, and the other side be 9/12. And once buildings are decided, then we could look at those buildings that could potentially hold and be well suited with some modifications to support a 6/12 environment with a better experience.
Thank you, Eric. There's a question about, moving, let's just say a consolidation happens from a small building to a large, or a 400 to a 900, for example, and what is our considerations around just some of the challenges with one, just the physical part of moving, but also like the education of those students in that space as something merges. So I'm not sure if someone has been here through the transition for Firm Bank, maybe could speak to like the logistics of a smaller to a larger, and then if someone from CNI can talk about educating students in a space that is larger, like again, a Firm Bank or Indian Creek, etc.
Well, I can talk from an operations point of view with the logistics. We do have a logistics team already employed by the district, and we do that on a number of occasions. We recently had a boundary change this past year, going into a larger facility, and our team has the logistics expertise in order to be able to move those children. Now, the important thing is how we line all this up, and that's why we're saying maybe it takes up to 8 years in certain areas. It won't all happen at once because we do need to consider logistics and also when. Primarily, it would be done during the summer, right? For long breaks would be kind of the obvious default, but maybe not in all cases, and perhaps it's a soft opening. But the most important thing is no matter what the transition is, we are dedicated and committed to making sure that students have strong instruction time per the calendar and per the school day, and with the least amount of disruptions as possible.
Thank you. Ms. Taylor, maybe you can just talk a little bit to how students are educated in large buildings. I know that we have plenty, especially in some of the areas that you support and supervise, and maybe how there isn't the changes or if there are differences in those school buildings compared to smaller ones. Or Dr. Tart?
Thank you, Ms. Smith. So in terms of educating students in a small building or a larger building, it really depends on logistics and planning, right? So looking at where grade levels are sitting within a building, how much transition time we build in, but just making sure that we have order and logistics that have been practiced, rehearsed, and that are efficient for students' movement as well as for instructional purposes. So whether you're in a small building or in a large building, these things are very important in terms of making sure that the academic performance and opportunity and equipment are there in place for scholars to have the best opportunity to learn at the highest level.
Thank you, Dr. Tart. There is a question about just the like this being so large. This is a large project, and so it seems like a very large and expansive restructuring. Did we consider evaluating doing this in smaller areas or where buildings are underutilized first versus overutilized? Like, let's talk a little bit about like how this aligns to one East BLOS funding, and then like how we're phasing the hope for or the process for phasing this out. Want to take that, Tracy?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, I think that you do see kind of the massiveness of, 25 plus buildings on something, it does come out and across them. We just want to be sure that, again, our first brush at this is to make sure that we have to look at the entire district. When Scott said that everything impacts everything, that's exactly right. I think historically districts do things like, boundary changes when they open a school and they think about maybe the next boundary or maybe the other boundary, but they don't think about kind of the bigger domino impact. And so and one of the reasons that you set an expectation for a longer timeline is that, yes, I think it can be more applicable in smaller bites. That as we look at, a 2 to 4 year, secure implementation, and then maybe a 5 to 8 year vision of realignment. I think that that's how you break this down into smaller elements. But I think that if we don't look at the entire district and apply that equitable criteria across, then it might be, the balance of this is that, trying not to appear inequitable, and then some of the things that go in there are perceived as inequitable. And and we make our best effort to, again, in the first round, even though it might, and not might, it is an overwhelming kind of thing to see that many school buildings. It was a first brush to say that we had to take a district-wide look at this thing, and it's a big district, and so the impact is going to be there. But I think as we go, again, we've had the unfortunate experiences in the past, especially 5 years of working with districts across the country that are smaller than you, that we have to do, 6 or 8 or 9 or 10 buildings, and those have as big an impact as, 25 or 27 buildings. And so, but what we have done is we've tried to make sure that the transition time is an appropriate amount of time to allow for some of these things that you might have concerns with. Things like if you're going to go into a different grade configuration, if you're going to go into a different school size, if you're going to go into a different program type of space. That's how we break this down to get it more concentrated, and so it doesn't seem so overwhelming. And again, we appreciate the community's patience in that as we walk through this iterative process of getting to more of the micro discussions that we will have in each community as we're impacting them more, that we start here, and then over the next several months we get into those more micro discussions to ensure that it does feel like a smaller element than the larger picture, because it will be more impactful to you in those discussions.
Thank you to that. I just want to address, I'm definitely asking these a little broader than some community members are putting in the chat. We are going to get to some cluster specific level stuff kind of in this next iteration. I think we've kind of pushed pretty hard on like, this is a huge overview. It is we're using metrics to kind of look at everything. So if there's very specific cluster levels, we're going to get to that. We're just not quite there yet. So I don't want people to think I'm ignoring their questions. We just aren't quite at the cluster specific level at the moment. Just want everybody to kind of understand the blanket approach and what we used the metrics to decide to get to this point. There is a question, and I don't know if anyone from finance is on here as well, but just about like kind of this difference between investment in consolidation versus investment in expansion. Is there a big difference? Is there one better than the other? That's kind of the question, I think. I don't know if there's anyone from finance. Yeah, Eric, you want to?
So if was the question revolving around money or
just like, is there a better model, like is consolidation to if you will save money for a school that then is no longer there versus expanding on a school? Is there any difference? Is there a large variance, if you will, between those two ideas?
Oh, well, from a construction point of view, it's generally cheaper or less expensive to add on to an existing school, if that is the question. And then obviously, if it can have a higher capacity, then you get a higher a return on your resources, right? So you get a little volume pricing, so to speak, on your resources, and that's really what this is about. From that point, from that lens, right? It's about resource management and about redirecting our resources into the student learning as much as possible. But I'm not sure if I answered. Did I get the spirit of the question?
Eric, can I just tap
Yeah,
onto that too also, because
absolutely.
I do think that understanding that the construction of a building is a one-time investment. The operationals is ongoing forever in a building. And so one of the things that we have to make sure of is that, eSPLOST dollars are specifically focused for those operational matters or capital matters in a district. The operational side were taxpayer dollars that come out of other resources other than the penny sales tax that cost to operate a district. And they're two separate funds in a district. And so we want to make sure that the one-time investments are the right investments for Mr. Hofstadter's team on the capital side. But on the other side is that we want to make sure that our long-term operational dollars are used in the right way. And so, so the one-time investment into a building that can save the 10, 20, 30-year return of investment on an operational side is a very important thing to consider. Again, one of the reasons we call it cost avoidance and not cost savings is that the dollars will go better and we won't have to spend the dollars where they're not necessary, both on an operational side and a capital side. And so I think that's where the finances go here. We want to make sure we're efficient on both one-time investments that are right investments, and then making sure that we avoid those longer-term operational costs that are recurring that we can better spend on students to go deeper and not wider.
Yeah. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you for shoring the question up a little more.
Appreciate it. So there's a question a little bit about, as we're talking about the funding piece a little bit, that, the neighborhoods are changing. You are seeing a shift in demographics. The specific question speaks to the fact that corporations are now, investing inside of neighborhoods and possibly could be getting some kind of tax break. And if that's the case, is that money then exempt from them paying taxes into the education system, similar to a house that pays taxes into the education system? So if a corporation or a business comes into a neighborhood and owns some property, are they then exempt from supporting the school district tax-wise? I have no idea who can answer.
Well, I think, I can
just
talk
a cool question.
From a general statement. I can talk to one area of this is that municipalities oftentimes drive and economic boards of municipalities and counties often drive that investment of those companies that come into. Whether they give the tax exempt status or not is not up to the school district. And so the school district does receive dollars from, taxable income, those kind of things that are related to just living in a boundary. But the tax exemptions aren't typically driven by a school board. They're typically driven by the municipality or the economic development board of a municipality or county or a government agency that tries to attract the business in. And so, Mr. Hofstadter, I don't know if there's examples in DeKalb County where you might show that even though the companies that come in that might show an exempt status, but still we see some income generation of taxes that come in because of that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right what you're saying. As a general rule, that is correct. So that's just to spur on economic development and provide incentives for corporations to set up shop here for that. However, before it actually gets approved, the school system generally does get notified of that, of an impending, and there can be some hearings on it. But ultimately, those are done outside of the school district as a general rule.
All right. All right. So this question is a little bit related to transportation again, and it just says, have we talked about or considered traffic flow kind of as an overlay to which schools or which buildings possibly close in an area? Like there are some that have 4-lane traffics, but only some that have 2. Are those type of things, were those brought into consideration as it relates to the closure list?
I can take that.
All right, Scott's going to take that.
That is something that we looked at, and we kind of looked at possible site expansions. We looked at the areas around the site and the sites themselves. But if you know, as being really truly boots on the ground, if you feel like there are sites that are better than others, please share that with us. One thing that I would like to just point out with just elementary schools in general is that when we have small school sites and you can't retain pickup and drop off traffic on site, you're going to have traffic. And so it's just one of those things that we want to consider. That's why we would like to look to have those larger sites. When we have for example, a larger middle school site, we've got the ability to kind of redesign that site to be able to retain traffic on site during pickup and drop off.
Thank you, Scott. All right, we have time for about 3 more, and then we're going to wrap up this. I will say that any questions that aren't answered, we are going to pull this and make sure we get those answers to you. And also we are answering other people's questions inside of the Q&A, so make sure you check those out as well. All right, so when specific buildings are identified for closure in the final scenario, how will we ensure that children continue to receive quality education during the interim with closures looming? Great question, because if that is on a list and people know it's on a list, there could be some flight from that. You guys have had some experience doing this. What's our interim strategy, Tracy, as you guys have gone through processes like this?
So I think there's 2 things that come to play. I think that one thing is that operationally you have to set up the transition from school to school, leadership to leadership, making sure that if a school is going to receive students or that's going to happen, that is a continuous process. And so whether it's site visits by students or leadership from the academic teams coming into the schools to introduce themselves and knowing the transition is going to be there and it's going to be smooth. Ensuring that when recommendations do come out, that we are very clear on the types of services and programs that will be in those buildings. And so people will be able to see what the result of their move will be. And so I think that that important piece of communication about the result of what the recommendation is going to be very important in this. And so, but I want to be sure that we know this, that facilities doesn't fix everything. There's an operational component to making sure that the right leadership is hired, the right teachers are hired, the right resources are hired in a building, and all that has to work to make sure that it's a team effort. The point of the facilities plan is to provide the infrastructure to maximize the ability to do that. And so when we have the right structure for facilities, then the ability then to communicate how the students will benefit from that transition has to be part of our recommendation. And so understand the concern. I don't know what's going to happen to my kid. And we don't want to, when we get to our recommendations, not only should we be very clear about when this might happen to your student or to your family or to your community, but the result of what that decision is. And so there's a lot of logistics that have to happen between a closure and a consolidation into a new building. And to allow that to happen in the recommendations, and again, there's a lot of pieces to this. We're going to be asked the reuse or the repurpose in this question. We're going to be asked the student transition. What's the bus route look like? What is what principal are we going to have? So there's a lot of questions that we answer, but only through good communication of when the recommendation comes out that we can assure that will happen. Once again, this is why the community piece is so important to us, is that understanding where your concerns are so we can address those up front. We don't want to make a decision and the concern come after that. And so the construction, the constructive, critical element of what the community brings to us are things just like that. These are our concerns. We're concerned that when you move, we won't get this. We're concerned that we won't get this. How do we solve that? And so the better we are prepared for that because of this community process, the better the transition will be.
Thank you, Tracy. All right, so this one, there's another pre-K-ish question, but it's also kind of tied to funding. So if our goal is really to be a little more fiscally responsible and to reallocate those funds back in classrooms, in the same token, we talk about possibly reusing some of those buildings as pre-K buildings, which are paid from local funding. So how do we say both? How do we want to possibly have pre-K buildings that pull more local funding, but also say that we want to reallocate those resources back into K-12 buildings, if you will. Hoff, do you want to talk a little bit about what's possibly happening at the legislation level around pre-K funding, like that there's might be some things coming down the pipe?
Yes, so there's thank you. There is quite a bit of discussion regarding pre-K right now at the legislation. Last year, the State Board of Ed and the legislature did approve certain capital outlay funding for pre-K classrooms, and that's a first ever because it's always ever only been K-12. So there are some movement there. We continue to monitor, but the reality is, that is a community-wide effort here in DeKalb County. It's very important to us. And the sooner we can begin to educate those children, much research shows that the more successful they will be early on. So it's a worthwhile investment to consider to watch and follow and figure out, if that is the goal and that is our value, then that is what we're going to do.
Great, thank you. All right, so there are still a lot of specific questions about specific schools and clusters, and I'll reiterate again, we're not answering specific school cluster questions on this call. We will pull this information from our communications team. We have the ability to send this out pretty massively as we used to do with SAP chats. We would answer the questions and send it to everyone that was on the call. So for specific cluster level, we can get you as much detail as possible, but we want to reiterate, this is still a pretty large scale plan. So we do not have all the ins and outs yet of each specific cluster or specific school. Again, to just get general information of do we understand how we got here and the metrics that we use, things of that nature. So we will we will pull this specifically and get to specific clusters. There's a few things around the challenges of wrapping people's heads around the 612. Eric, can you explain that just for clarity, that building? It is technically two separate buildings with shared spaces. I think people think it's two separate full buildings, but just what is the design for Sequoia so people could just understand a little bit more of the 612 possible model?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's basically two wings, if you will, of a school. The middle school side is roughly 4 stories, and the high school side is roughly 5 stories. It is joined together, but also separated down the middle. So you can't get from one side to the other without going outside the building and going to the other part of the school. All right. But in there, you will have gym space, and there's 3 gyms. Some will be specifically for our middle school specifications. Some will be for the high school specifications, and they will have limited access to each other in order to do that. So that's kind of how, but it is one contiguous building. It goes all the way around, and then obviously shared outside spaces such as fields, and parking and things of that nature. But we'll have more signage, and we're going to try to bring some order to it as much as possible. But it will be a new venture on a 612 design.
Great. And then I'm gonna pull one that talks a little bit about school buildings that are on the closure list, but have a program in them. So there are a few on there. Just want to say overall, we're committed to maintaining the current programs that we have, as well as the number of seats. We are doing an evaluation kind of subcommittee with Hanover Research on how to evaluate school choice programs, which we do not do consistently at the moment, to determine any growth or changes in that. But we are committed to those, meaning that if that school is on a closure list that we would like to place it somewhere else, I want to fully recognize that IB authorization schools, there are a few on that list, and we are aware. Some people have sent us some information like, hey, by the way, you can't just move an IB program. So thank you for that. Something that we caught on the back end of that first round. So that may be something we have to reconsider, especially schools that have the IB authorization, because they, again, can't move buildings and it's a 5-year process. So something we'll have to think about in this next iteration. So thank you for that. All right, so as I stated, any other questions in here as we wrap up that we did not answer in this open list, we will go ahead and get you those answers and send that out through our communications team will help us get that out to everyone that is on the call. You did have to register, so if you gave us an email, you'll get the answers that way. We do have a lot of FAQs, again, on our specific SAP website. That just gives some general overview to some of the questions in here. If they're not answered, we'll make sure we get those answered for you. And I'm going to hand it over to Hofstetter to close us out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarita. Thank you, team, and most of all, thank you to all our community members that joined us here today. And I really appreciate your thought-provoking questions. They're all valid, and we want to be able to answer all those. Particularly as we continue this journey as a collaborative community conversation. You heard many times we still have to flesh some things out, but we can't do that without your input. So again, I want to say thank you for engaging with us. Your voice truly matters, and it will inform our next steps. So please, 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 please fill out the surveys and continue to stay engaged. If your question was not answered, or you think of something else once this is over later today, please use that feedback link that was dropped in the chat. And that will stay open, I think, until March 8th. So please tell us your input before March 8th on that link. And again, with that, we'll be here all week by registration if it's online. But again, thank you for joining us today, and we sincerely look forward to your thoughts.